If the Mikko Rantanen trade taught us anything, we are in store for some massive trades at this year's deadline. And recently, Bleacher Report put out an article going through every team's top bargaining chip for the deadline this year. So we're going to be going through the article, seeing what I agree, what I disagree with, and who could be the top players available at the deadline this year. So make sure you watch till the end for all the trade deadline rumors, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more trade content just like this as we lead up to the deadline in March. I'm excited to deep dive into this one because I feel like there's going to be some interesting picks. Already we see the thumbnail with Elias Pettersson there with the Vancouver Canucks, but the headline reads, every NHL team's top bargaining chip to use at the deadline. And this, I think, is going to get pretty interesting. Starting us out here, we got from the Anaheim Ducks, defenseman Brian Dumoulin, and I think this does make sense. They go on to say how Trevor Zegras isn't likely to be dealt, how John Gibson could be dealt, but his value of his contract is a little bit lower than some people might expect. In Dumoulin's case, he's one of the easiest Ducks to move at the deadline. Now, if this was a couple months ago, I probably would have said Brink Vetrano was the top candidate for the Ducks, but in Dumoulin's case, he's going to be very easy to deal. He just makes $3.1 million, and it's just as a rental contract, so it's not a lot of commitment there. But in Dumoulin's case, of course, is a big left shot D. He's something that's had a decent season with Anaheim, nothing all that special, but considering the rest of the Ducks defense, I think he's been one of the better ones for them in a bottom pair penalty kill role. He's going to be a cheap, inexpensive ad, and somebody that I think a lot of teams want to bring on for that experience and for that consistency. Next up out of the Boston Bruins, their pick is Trent Frederic, which makes sense. Not all that surprising. We talked about Freddie on this channel for a long time over the last few months, and he's somebody that will be a top candidate for the deadline. I will say maybe a Brandon Carlo could perhaps be a part of a larger, maybe like JT Miller type of trade, but Frederic is the most likely guy to go. Now, interestingly here, onto the Buffalo Sabres, we got Bowen, Byram, and this is something that is interesting. We've heard a lot about how the Sabres are interested in Elias Pettersson. They're trying to go big game hunting. Bowen Byram, I think, would pretty easily be a part of a trade. He's somebody that's had an NHL career that's been all over the place, but it's still somebody that I think has some good offensive potential, especially up the ice, on the rush with his confidence there. It's something that I think Buffalo's been able to unlock, even though I think he's gone a little bit cold over the last few weeks. He still has 23 points in 49 games, and still I think could be a serviceable middle pair type of offensive D. But considering his youth and also the contract, which really isn't all that high at $3.8 million, this is somebody that I could easily see being attached a part of a Elias Pettersson trade or any other deal that we see, even though I think for Buffalo, trading Byram will be a little bit silly, especially after they just traded for him at the last deadline. Considering their logjam on the left side of the defense, I feel like it was always a problem that was going to come up eventually. So I like that pick. I think BR is 3 for 3 in the picks so far. Now we have a lot more to get to in today's video, but let's first talk about today's sponsor in Southern New Hampshire University, and specifically their online sports management degree. No matter your position in life, if you want to get into sports management, SNHU is a great way to get your foot in the door. They have 40 total courses that take you through the business and management aspect of the sports world, and it's all 100% online. So no matter where you are, you can apply. And it's very easy to apply, not needing any college essays or test scores, just basic information to get you started. But time is ticking. Since the next term starts on March 3rd, you'll want to get applied quick. Whether you're young or old, just starting out a career or in a long time one, it's never too late to switch up and get into the sports business. Use my link, it'll be on the description down below as well as on the video here, and just click that link and you'll be able to apply right there and then. A big thank you to Southern New Hampshire University for sponsoring today's video, and let's get right back into it. Now onto the Calgary Flames, and their top candidate is Dan Vladar, and this one is interesting to me because they go on to say how Andrei Kuzmenko could probably go, but he's having such a down year that it's unlikely any team would give up anything real for him, and I would agree with that, but also, what has Dan Vladar done to really accumulate any value whatsoever? I think he could be potentially a backup option for other teams, but to me, I think Kuzmenko is the most likely to go, even though he's had his inconsistencies this year. That's still somebody that has proven to be a top goal scorer in the past, and even though it hasn't been a fit in Calgary, I could see another team adding him just to that top power play and getting some immediate results. Is a team going to give any picks or any assets at all for a player like Vladar, who hasn't even put up a 900 plus save percentage since 2022? I don't know how likely that is. Now on the Hurricanes, and their top candidate is a first round pick, and interestingly, this article was made right before the Mikko trade. And it's interesting that we didn't see a first round pick a part of that deal. Instead, a second, a fourth, and of course, players like Jack Drury instead. I feel like if the Canes didn't trade a first for Rantanen, I don't know if they're going to trade a first for anybody else. But I look at that lineup, and I still think there's opportunity to add on to it. I don't know if the Islanders would want to trade Brock Nelson within the division, but you look at what that center group would be with him, and you'd have Aho, Nelson, Kotkaniemi, and Stahl. I think that top four would be pretty great, especially after the Canes traded Jack Drury in the Rantanen trade. It leaves a little bit of a hole in their center group. So I feel like for the Canes, that they're going to really try to complete that roster, complete that four group, we will see another trade. I don't know if the first round pick will be involved, and we'll see that type of quality of player, but it's something to think about. Now, like I said, this article was made right before the Rantanen trade, and for the Blackhawks, their pick seems to be Taylor Hall, which I guess was a BR dub because it happened right after this article was released. Now, if there's anybody else that could be dealt, I think it will be Ryan Donato, considering his solid year he's having up to this point, on pace for 48 points, which isn't unbelievable or anything, but considering Chicago, it's pretty good. Personally, for me, I wouldn't be selling anybody else if I'm Chicago. They've already bottomed out so much, and I think bottoming out even more would be detrimental to them. But I do understand that. I think Donato could get some sneaky value on the market, at least a second-round pick, if not more. Now, they're going to say for the Colorado Avalanche, Callum Ritchie, and they say that Callum Ritchie is arguably the Avalanche's top prospect, right there, Guliayev for me, and it would likely take quite a haul to get them to part with him, and absolutely. But if they were going to swing the fences on a big trade, it would probably include him. Now, we have seen the Avs' big trade with Rantanen to the Canes. Ritchie, of course, was not a part of that deal, but not really any reason to be because Rantanen was the big piece of that trade. I really doubt, though, that the Avs would trade Ritchie, considering how much of a fit I think he will be for their future, how solid of a middle six piece I think he will be for them. I just feel like for the Avs, for trying to have that longevity, Ritchie is a core part of that. Especially for the Avs and how rough their center situation has been this year with players like Casey Middlestat not really being able to fill that consistently. Callum Ritchie is a solidified center that has some good size, great skill, and he's something that I just don't think the Avs can really afford to lose for their future. Even though he isn't quite up to that level yet of being a top 6 player, I think he can eventually be, and I think he is the one player the Avs should absolutely be keeping. Now, this was an interesting one with the Blue Jackets being Ivan Provorov, and I thought the case for trading him was pretty interesting. Obviously, we know the Blue Jackets have been a fantastic team up to this point, at least compared to expectations, really rising above where they should be. Now, Provorov has been up and down this season. There's been times where I think he's lived up to his potential, times where, especially defensively, you want a lot more. But overall, I think he's been a bigger part of that success rather than a detriment. But he's somebody that, with the case here, potentially being in a trade, they talk about how he could be one of the top defensemen on the market and what the cost might be to re-sign him, $7-8 million or more. If the Blue Jackets can get a round pick for him, they should take that and flip it for another player who is younger, under team control, and fits in with the timeline of the other younger players on the roster. And I thought this was an interesting case because for Columbus, it kind of all depends on what they want to do. Do they see this as their chance to really go for it? If that's the case, I don't think they'll trade a player like Provorov. I think they'd rather let him go in that situation than trade him. But I feel like for Columbus and kind of still the retooling situation they're in the youth situation they're in, I feel like I wouldn't go for an extremely younger player. I'd want to get somebody that still has a pedigree of NHL success. But in Provorov's case, whether or not that's with Columbus, he's going to want to get paid this offseason. And for the Blue Jackets, they're going to have to do a lot of soul searching if they actually want to keep him long term, because you have a lot of defensemen coming up, a lot of young prospects who will want to come up into that role. But considering the Blue Jackets have $30 million to work with this offseason, they're going to have a lot of money if they do want to re-sign Provorov to make that happen. Now, for my favorite team in the Dallas Stars, 2025 first-round pick does make sense. Now, considering what the Stars have done drafting-wise, I don't think trading a first-round pick is all that detrimental. They've proven to get steal after steal outside the first round, so I wouldn't mind them trading the first-round pick, especially this year. I think they could really use some defensive additions, Jim Nill, that aren't Matt Dumba, but I think it's going to be an interesting deadline for them. Now, I will say, especially in Lyubushkin's case, I think he's actually played really well for them over the last couple of months, but Dumba has just been a black hole on the defensive side that I think just cannot go unnoticed. I think they absolutely need an upgrade to him on that bottom pair on that right side. A lot of talk around David Savard. I don't know if I would love that too much, but in the bottom pair role, I think he could be serviceable. I think that I'd want them to personally go bigger, maybe for a middle pair defenseman, put Lyubushkin on the bottom pair. That to me would be perfect, but I think for the Stars, that is going to be the biggest priority for them. Getting that defensive addition like last year in Tanev that can hopefully put him over the top this time. Now for the Detroit Red Wings, the pick here is Vladimir Tarasenko, and honestly, I don't really disagree with this. I think for all sides, a Tarasenko trade will be best. He just has not been that great of a fit for Detroit, and even though he's been a little bit better since the coaching change, really hasn't been all that substantial. Still on pace for only 34 points this year. I think on a different team, Tarasenko would be better, but I also think he maybe could be a part of a larger deal. I would also want to mention Jonathan Berggren, who I think has been better since the coaching change for sure. He's on pace for about 14 goals this year. He's somebody that I think could really be boosting his value for a potential deal later on. If Detroit really wants to go for it for the playoffs, they really want to make some substantial changes, I could easily see both of these guys being dealt in a potential deal for a bigger, more consistent forward, really. And both of these guys just haven't been on that level consistently to warrant keeping them long term. Now, I love for the Edmonton Oilers, their pick is just prospects. Anybody will do. Now, I do agree with the assessment that the Oilers roster is good, but it still has some flaws. However, they don't have a lot to trade. They have no 2025 first rounder and only 4 picks total in this year's class. They do have a 2026 first round pick, and it should not be off the table. Neither should any other prospects, including first rounder Sam O'Reilly. And even though I'm a big Sam O'Reilly fan, yeah, no. For the Oilers' position and what they're in, I think they should be trading everybody possible. Every single year should be a go-for-it year of Connor McDavid, and this year is no different. Now, the Panthers pick was an interesting shout, with Justin Sordiff being the option here, talking about how Stanley Cup champions, of course, do not have a lot of weaknesses, but they still have the chance to make another run of the championship, how their resources are thin. But I think Sordiff is an interesting one. They say that he might have an NHL future and could be attracted to teams looking to sell. I would agree in this case. And Sordiff, I think he is probably just going to be a fourth liner in the end, but his physicality that he's always had as a prospect could make him pretty enticing. He's a prospect that I think is an unfortunate byproduct of just how solid Florida has been from top to bottom, because I think otherwise he would have gotten more of a shot in the NHL, especially when you look at the AHL production over the past few years and how he's been able to improve and improve. He's somebody that I think point production wise has been pretty terrific and has continued to be that. I think could pretty easily be a bottom 6 guy for some other team like a San Jose, for example. We'll see what Florida ends up doing. I don't think they're going to go for any massive moves, but I could see sort of being a part of a depth trade perhaps. Now for the Kings, the pick here is a first round pick, and I completely understand. I do want to say though, for the Kings, I don't think they should be going for a rental. I think they should be going for more of a long-term piece, especially within that top 6, potentially on the left wing. I think for them could be really beneficial. I think for the Kings, as they talk about here, how they're on pace to face the Oilers again in the first round, I don't know if that's going to be a winning first round for them again, and I feel like they could get bounced once more, and I feel like if the rental is what they go after, it could be even more disappointing. I think for the Kings, they should be looking at that long-term perspective if they are especially going to be using that first rounder. Now on to a team that I think also should be making some pretty major moves in the Minnesota Wild. They list future draft picks as the assets, and I would also agree with this, though I do want to mention one player that I think honestly should be dealt, and that is John Merrill, somebody that at least this season, whenever I've watched Minnesota, it kind of just feels like the weak link on that defense, especially that he's playing middle pair minutes right now on that left side. I think you could get a big upgrade there. I get that he's big, he's cheap, just making 1.2 million, but I think for Minnesota, if they really want to go far in these playoffs, the defense, I think, needs to be looked at and needs to be prioritized. In Merrill's case, I think he could get replaced pretty easily to find a better option there. I think that's what Minnesota should be doing, especially if they're going to be trading draft picks. That's what I would be going for. On to Montreal, and the pretty easy pick is, of course, Jake Evans, though we all know Montreal has so many different options. We have heard recently how Montreal's been potentially trying to extend Evans, but the good thing, I think, for Montreal, if you're looking at the trade market, is that even if they do extend him, they still got a lot of other options. You got David Savard, Christian Dvorak, but to me, the most likely player to be dealt in Yoel Armia, making $3.4 million as a rental this year, and he's been pretty awesome to watch for the Habs this season. In an offensive role, he's been solid in the penalty kill situations with Evans. Those two have been dynamic together. He's been a really effective all-around forward who is just having a solid season all around, on pace for 36 points this year. I think he's been a pretty impactful part of Montreal's offense and the improvements made this season. I think Armia is somebody that I think even more than Evans is somebody that I'd want Montreal to trade. I can see why you'd want to keep Evans long-term, the center position, still how young he is, but Armia just makes so much sense to deal, even if he's been solid this year. I don't know how much it's going to continue on to that long-term projection for Montreal. I could easily see some team, though, adding him onto that third line and getting some really good clutch goal scoring in the end. Now on to Nashville, which I'm sure has a plethora of options. Interestingly, they talk about Gustav Nyquist, and I think he's somebody that has been a pretty big part of this disappointing season for the Preds. He's the only big-time player on this Nashville team that is a rental, just making $3.1 million for this year. He was one of the biggest surprises in the NHL last season, where he got 75 points in 81 games. You can see, like a lot of Nashville, and honestly, I think is the biggest example of Nashville's decline, he's on pace for now just 35. Now, considering he's 35 years old, not the most surprising thing in the world, but he still, I think, could be a valuable third-line player for a lot of teams out there, and especially considering his low cap hit, could easily get dealt. You add on the fact that he has zero trade protection either, and this is somebody I think could get a lot at the deadline. Even though he's not having the greatest year, I could see him rebounding in a new situation, just like he did with Nashville before. Now for New Jersey, they list draft picks as the answer, and it seems like with Simone Nemec and the quietness we've seen on his trade front, the draft picks I think are the most likely thing to be dealt if we are to see the Devils really try to improve that roster. I mean, especially with how the Carolina Hurricanes try to do it with Mikko Rantanen, the Devils I think are going to have a lot more pressure at this deadline to try to really improve and deadline, they're a team that I think could be pretty interesting here. Now for the Islanders, no-brainer, of course, is Brock Nelson. We're going to be talking about him a lot at this deadline. One of the strongest pieces at the deadline this year. Even though he's not having the greatest season up to this point, his pedigree of goal scoring and consistency before this year, I think he's going to have a lot of teams giving at least a first-round pickup for him. And I think is one of the most likely rentals to get that high package when it's all said and done. Okay. For the New York Rangers, Artemi Panarin? I don't know what just got into this article has been pretty sensible, pretty sane up until this point, but my goodness. Okay, y'all, I'm gonna need the explanation here. The Rangers are the biggest wild card in the NHL right now. They entered the season with Stanley Cup expectations, but have fallen badly short of them. They already traded Trouba and Kakko, and they still have an uphill fight when it comes to making the playoffs. The core of the team might need a reset. Rangers fans would probably love to move on from Zibanejad, but the other 31 and other NHL teams likely want nothing to do with that contract, which is true. If the Rangers don't make a big move to get back in the playoff spot, there's a scenario where they become sellers. If they do, would they be willing to dangle Artemi Panarin? This would certainly be the time to do it. He still has 1 year remaining on his contract and is still a top-tier offensive player. The Rangers could probably get a haul for him to help them hit the reset button. It's a long shot, yes, and likely won't happen, but it's something to ponder. And I mean, I guess that's true. It is definitely something to think about. I don't know if it's going to happen, though. There was that bad turnover in overtime. I do get that. Panarin is still an integral piece of this Rangers team, though, and with how they've played over the last couple of weeks, especially how much better they've done, I feel like trading Panarin at that point would just be a kick in the butt that the Rangers don't need right now. I get trying to reset the core, but Panarin is probably the last player I touch of that core. Still is somebody that is a top offensive producer, even if this season hasn't been up to his usual level. I get this, but also considering his cap hit, considering how much of a part he is of that Rangers team, a part of the marketing, a part of the franchise, I doubt this happens. Still, though, I respect the balls to put him at this spot, but I just don't see it. Now, we go into the Ottawa Senators, and their selection here is 2025 draft picks. And I would agree up to an extent. I feel like the Sens should be keeping their first rounder. But then again, with how they've drafted recently, I don't know how much they really need those picks in the end, but I digress. I think for the Senators, they're a team that could really also go for it. Just like Detroit, they're in a position where they're disheartened by the failures of the past, trying to improve, trying to get better. As I'm recording this, third in the Atlantic Division, but obviously still in need of some improvements. I think especially on that defense, there's a lot you can improve. The depth of the foregroup, I think, could also be processed. There's a lot to work with there and a lot of options for Ottawa to get creative. Now for the Flyers, this is a team that has a lot of options. There's Joel Verity, Morgan Frost. I mean, really, half of that foregroup seems like it could get dealt, but Scott Laughton makes a lot of sense. He's something that we've talked about a lot, of course, with the grind style he has, the low cap hit. He's something I think a lot of contenders would love to have. For Laughton, you always know what you're getting. I mean, you look over the past few years, and he's always been hovering around that 40-point mark, on pace for another just under 40-point season. Is a third-line grind forward. I think he's something that a lot of teams are going to like. You look at a team like Boston and a team that could really use some forward additions. Scott Laughton, I think, could pretty perfectly fit in that system. I think for the Flyers, even though they might not get as much as they want, which could be like a first-round pick if we saw a trade a couple of years ago, I still think you could get some decent value for Laughton when it's all said and done because of that play style and how much it matters in the playoffs. On to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Marcus Pettersson is the pick here. We have heard a little bit about Erik Karlsson, and also with the Penguins just horrible play over the last month or so. I wouldn't be surprised if potentially even an Evgeny Malkin is out there, but Pettersson is the most likely to get dealt, especially with his rental contract. He's somebody that will get easily traded, and I think for Pittsburgh, it's something they should be looking at, especially with the value you can get back there. It's a no-brainer for the Penguins, who should be going in more of a retooling direction. On to the Sharks, another no-brainer here in Mikael Granlund, though personally for me, he is somebody that I would keep, especially when you look at the Sharks and just how rough this season has gone again. I think they need more players to right that ship in the end. Mikael Granlund is a part of that, even though he's not, of course, a part of a Celebrini line or anything or helping out with the production there. He's still leading his own line and still getting up great results. And I think for the Sharks especially, they need more Granlund on their team. They need more guys like that for the future. And I just feel like for the Sharks, they've already stripped it down to the studs so much that I think Granlund is especially somebody that you need to keep for the long term. Though absolutely, I will be the first to admit that he would get a big haul because he is a great player and one of the most underrated ones over the past few years since he's gone to San Jose, but is somebody that I just think because of that is somebody that San Jose needs to keep. The value they built him up is a good thing, and I think they should reward themselves by sticking with it. Now on to Seattle, another pretty obvious one here in Yanni Gourde. He's somebody we talked about a lot on this channel. You look at a Scott Laughton and the playoff performance that he could have. Yanni Gourde has had that consistently with Tampa and Seattle. He's somebody that will be a perfect third line center for a lot of contenders out there. We've heard a lot of talk about how Toronto needs a centerman. Yanni Gourde, I think, could perfectly fit there in a Max Domi type of spot, more of a defensive role there. Gourde, I think, is a really underrated one, and I think will surprise a lot of people by how much he ends up getting Seattle in the end, because I think his value might be a lot higher to GMs out there because of that consistency when it comes to the playoffs. Now onto the Blues, and another person we talked about here in Brandon Saad. He's somebody that I think will be a really interesting middle six piece here. It seems like he's already requested a trade, already potentially is on his way out of St. Louis, and I think for the Blues, that makes sense, especially in Saad's case. He's not getting any younger, and I think for the Blues going into more of a youth direction, Saad makes sense to deal. Now on to Tampa Bay, and they don't mention the first-round picks because Tampa doesn't have a first-round pick this year, but they do mention second-round picks, and this is interesting because I don't think it's getting talked about a lot when we talk about Tampa and this deadline. They have 2 second-round picks at this year's draft, which I think is interesting because I think they could leverage that to potentially trade here. And obviously, with Tampa, they're always fighting towards the cap, so I don't think they're going to be bringing on an Elias Pettersson anytime soon. But considering how much Tampa's always loved to add these depth deals on the outside that end up becoming mainstays on their team, like Brandon Hagel, for example, those 2 second-round picks could easily get another type of player up that alley. Now on Toronto, and they mentioned their 2026 first rounder. Now, the Leafs do have their 2025 first. If I was going to trade either of those, I would definitely trade this one, especially with how solid the regular season success has been up to this point. That's probably going to end up inside the 25 range or so, and I think that's something that the Leafs can afford to lose. But I feel like for Toronto, they're just in a weird spot where I feel like they could really stand to make some major additions, but I do not want to see them go in the rental market and try to completely go for it this year because that has bit them in the back before. I think more of these long-term additions for Toronto, especially in the middle 6 for that 4 group, I think are important. It's something that Tampa Bay has absolutely nailed that Toronto should also be doing. Now on to Utah, and they list Alexander Kerfoot here, and I think there's a few interesting options for Utah who is kind of in a weird spot. I remember about a month ago, we had Frank Seravalli coming out and saying how Utah could be sellers, trying to make the playoffs in their first year, but with how they played since then, really poorly, by the way, I just don't see Utah really being justifiable to go for it, be true buyers, unless they're getting long-term pieces for the future, like an Elias Pettersson somehow. I think most likely when it comes to the deadline, when the time actually comes, Utah's going to be a pretty underrated seller, and they'll have a lot of options there. You look at the amount of UFAs throughout the group, and there's a lot of players that could be dealt as rentals. You got, of course, Alex Kerfoot, but also Nick Bjugstad and Michael Carcone on the 4 group. On the defense, you got Ian Cole, Olli Mata, and on the goaltending side, Karel Velmelka could also be a potential piece if they want to ride Connor Ingram long-term. We'll see what ends up happening, but if Utah actually goes as sellers, they're going to have quite a bit of options to work with, especially when you consider they don't have any extra picks in this year's draft. I think Utah could really stand to change that. What I could see is Utah going seller mode at this year's deadline, stocking up on picks, and then ultimately going crazy at the draft, trading for multiple top-end players, kind of like what they did at that last draft last year. So we'll see what happens, but if I'm Utah, that's the direction I would go in. On to Vancouver, and of course, the big talk of the town is Elias Pettersson. It seems like JT Miller and the trade talks there have slowed down, while Pettersson is now the main candidate for the Canucks, which is absolutely insane to me. Reportedly, we were close to a Pettersson to a Carolina type of trade that didn't end up happening. Right now, it's all over the place. I don't think Vancouver should trade Pettersson, but it seems like amid the Vancouver franchise, I would be alone in that because Pettersson seems to be getting a lot more steam. We'll see what ends up happening, but this is going to be one to track for a while here. Now on to Vegas. They mentioned Trevor Connolly as the main piece here, and this is interesting because, of course, we know that Vegas has a all up and down prospect pool. I think they have a few interesting options, but Trevor Connolly is by far their best. If they do want to go for a big-time player, Connolly would absolutely be a part of it. Though, if I'm Vegas, if there's one prospect I'm keeping, it is him, because I think he can be a difference maker offensively. We'll have to wait and see. I don't think he's truly made himself untouchable. He hasn't been on that type of level, but it's going to be a really interesting one, because I think for Vegas, if they trade another first-round pick, that future is going to be in a weird spot. We'll see. Vegas has been proven, of course, to trade their first-round picks before. Connolly could be another one up that line. Now, this one I actually disagree with Washington and their 2025 draft picks. I understand that Washington has had a great season up to this point, and in some respects, even better than they should be. But I'm personally team keep the picks if I'm the Capitals. One of the major reasons why this season has been such a success is because of the draft picks and the young guys that they've had coming up into major spots on the roster. Players like Connor McMichael have been big leaders on the team, but that's because they kept them. If Washington a couple years back, when they were really toiling away in the mediocre spot in the NHL, decided to try to trade those type of guys, where would they be this season? I think that's a pretty major question. And I think for the Capitals, even though they could stand to go for a couple rentals here and there, I just don't really understand the process there. I understand, of course, that Alex Ovechkin is getting old, is not getting any younger, but I think for the Capitals, the success has been because of that youth. You might as well keep it going and keep that train going and get as many draft picks as possible and keep that going, because I think for the Capitals has been one of the major reasons for their success, and it's something that they should try to balance. I get if they want to make a pretty big trade here, but I think for the Capitals, keeping their draft picks will be pretty important going forward. And on to the last player mentioned here with the Winnipeg Jets and Nikolai Ehlers. Now, here's the thing. Ehlers seems to have been in trade rumors, it feels like, for the last 10 years up to this point with Winnipeg. But he is somebody that I've always been a pretty big fan of, with the speed that he has. When he's at his best, the skill level he's able to provide. I think for the Jets, he's had a solid season up to this point. Though if his contract looming, I could understand if they end up dealing it. He's over a point per game this season and having one of his best seasons with the Jets, but like we just saw with Mikko Rantanen, it doesn't matter how you're doing. If that contract situation is a problem, then we could see a trade at any point. I think Ehlers could be up the same situation. I think he's going to be asking for a lot of money this year that Winnipeg might not be all too crazy about giving him. So this is going to be an interesting one to track as well. For the Jets, I think they're more likely to just keep him and let him go in free agency, considering how well they've done this year, how they're going to try to go for it again. But Ehlers is going to be somebody that could potentially be dealt for maybe a 1-for-1 for a player that has a lot more term and a lot more structure going forward. But Ehlers is going to be one to keep an eye on. I just feel like for the Jets, though, if I'm them, I keep him as much as I humanly can. But that was Bleacher Report's top trade candidates for every single team. And I want to know your thoughts down below, what you guys agreed, what you guys disagree with, and who would be your top candidate from your team that you think will get dealt this trade deadline. Let me know your thoughts down below on that. Of course, make sure you share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and click that like button, click that subscribe button, click the notification bell if you haven't already. Of course, click on this card for all my trade content run one playlist, and I will see you guys in the next one. Drink some water for me, and goodbye.